The next topic is technology and financial data architecture, and our presenter is Dr. Kingsley Jones, who is a research fellow at CIFR. So please welcome Kingsley.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so it falls to me to discuss the technology dragon. So I might begin with a small humorous but cautionary tale. I think I'm probably one of the very few people who, as a 12-year-old, received a visit from ASIO. It was quite a funny story, actually. Yes, the men in black turned up at my house. And my mum thought they were very well turned out, very nicely turned out, so she made them a cup of tea. And whilst we were chatting, it transpired they actually had come to visit me because apparently I had found out about a top secret classified Swedish weapons system, and they wanted to find out how. And of course, being an inquisitive 12-year-old, I told them exactly where I found out: the public library. And so I think the purpose of sharing that with you is that information wants to be free. It's a bit of a cliche. And I think what we really need to talk about today is the extent to which digital technologies and information are likely to shape the future of financial services. So I'll cover off these four basic areas: digital services innovation, great growth in internet business models, customer information protections in the age of big data, cybersecurity risks and opportunities, and then finally a topic we're researching quite actively at CIFR. I'm running a program on data architecture and regulatory analytics, so we'll explain what that's about. So, this first topic, it's really the elephant in the room. Technology and service innovation. I have on the right there just a few logos from different things that might strike the conversation. Get it started. Bitcoin, obviously, big innovation in payment systems. What do you do about that? Visa PayWave, a completely different way of paying, and therefore opens up a whole bunch of questions about the risks associated with someone who has my card being able to authorise payments, and what do you do about shifting the balance of retribution, if you will, as to who pays for the mistakes, and a whole host of other things. The key points that I would like to make here is that digital service models are global. That's clear. I mean, look at the internet and the growth of Google, for example. But our tax and regulatory structures are local. So it's the tension between these two things which we think is going to be the most important factor in trying to understand, firstly, where we're going, what's actually already happening, so to say, in the world, and also what to do about it from a regulatory point of view. The other thing I would like to say is that I'd like to ask a question. Are jurisdictional legal innovations technologies? I think there's a tendency when we speak about technology and regulation to think technology is just computers or something like that. I think there's also some technology at work in the form of legal structures, particularly around managed funds. So let me try to explain what I mean. I'm sure lots of people in this room would be aware that whilst we are the fourth biggest funds market in the world, we only get about 3% of our assets from offshore. And a lot of that has to do with, there's a host of reasons, and there's various efforts to understand that as to why we're not more successful in gathering foreign assets. But one thing is noteworthy. Firstly, those countries that have been very successful are typically using legal innovations like UCITS fund structures out of Ireland and Luxembourg. And then in the US, there's been a lot of innovation around using structures like the limited liability company, which just happens to be a legal innovation in the US, which is about 30 or 40 years old. And it's in its favour as an innovation, it has the merit that it's an entity, legal entity, that can choose how it's taxed according to an election. So it can be taxed as a C corporation, an S corporation, a partnership, and it can even be what's called a disregarded entity for effectively a sole trader. So we see a lot of innovation in the US in using LLCs as a different way to organise funding, and in fact there's many listed financial firms in the US that are structured as LLCs. So big question there. In the Australian context, Of course, we have a relatively unusual fund industry in its use of trust structures, and we also have some interesting winkles, if we will, on the tax treatment of foreign exchange transactions. So I don't want to bore you with it, but the technology, if you will, of how we, within the ATO, view foreign currency transactions for taxation purposes is pretty unique and actually very complicated. And that actually makes it difficult for generating trade offshore. So I would like to draw attention to that. Within the report, there was a very interesting question posed, and we'll ask you this question at the end. Should regulatory settings be technology neutral? That is to say, should the regulatory system be preferring some technologies over others? Now, what I would like to do today is to slightly rephrase that and say, is this really a business model question? So should the regulatory system be favouring some business models over others? And around that particular issue, draw attention to some research we have in progress at CIFR. You've heard about Geoff Weir's work on understanding fee structures. I'm leading a program to have a look at what the real costs of SMSF, for example, structures are, since they operate differently. And in fact, some CIFR-funded researchers, Adrian Rafferty, has presented some work on other occasions about the measuring the cost of SMSFs. So I think that probably the bigger question there is, should the regulatory system be trying to mandate business models in an age where we have great opportunity to reduce distribution costs by using the internet, and what are the regulatory considerations there? And related to that, I guess, is are regulations operating as a barrier to trade? So the final point I would make is, I just mention, if I can find this funny looking little pig here is just one logo of an entity in the US I pulled out. It's not the only one. What they do is they provide what you would call scaled advice in this current debate. It's an online place you go to receive a model portfolio. You make a selection of different risk grades, and then you buy that product through your broker. And that's provided at the bargain basement price of $120 per year. And if you have less than $10,000, it's free. So when we consider that that's what's happening in other markets, then I think we do have to be prepared for a tide of great change that's simply new business models. Customer information. This one's a tricky one. I think the obvious points to cover off is, of course, privacy and security is important, but in the age of Google, if you Google yourself, you're sometimes surprised at what you find out you did. And indeed, that's the big problem behind this. What I would say is that, firstly, I think from a technology perspective, it's actually quite difficult to regulate cross-border flow. I mean, this is just a little map of the internet. You might be surprised where your data goes to get to where you think it was going. And this is often a function of how telcos are organised. So, for example, if a company was wanting to use cloud services in Asia, they may be surprised to find that actually most of their traffic goes via the west coast of the United States before it gets to Asia. And that's just the way the economics of the internet works. So that's quite difficult. I think the other thing is this little squirrel here. That just is the name of a company that specialises in a different kind of database where, in addition to having access to the database, you can have a logical query level access as to what you're actually asked to, what you're allowed to ask the database. So technologies like that actually help privacy protocols and controls, because you can put in place ways to, say, purposefully aggregate information. So certain people who query that database can only receive a certain level of detail. So we are seeing some very positive changes there. Cloud computing is obviously important with security, but I think most private businesses have that under control. I guess the final one that's very difficult for policymakers is this thing called the mosaic principle. For those who don't know, if you're involved in data security, the mosaic principle refers to the fact of my story, my cautionary tale at the beginning. You know, ASIO is probably thinking, how the hell did this little 12-year-old kid figure out all this stuff? Well, I just put the pieces together. And the pieces were readily available through public sources. The mosaic principle in the internet context means, you know, you put together the picture and then you know what it is. It's pineapple in this case. But certainly with consumer data on the web, LinkedIn, all this sort of stuff, you can learn an enormous amount just by putting it together. Cybersecurity, we got our little Greek character from mythology here, Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. I actually think that that's probably never going to change. There is a constant dance between those who would like to use what they know about security to, engage in crime or fraud or other activities, and then we have the enforcers who would like to stop them. There is specific mention made of this idea of a trusted digital identity using modern technology to have, as it were, some kind of unique ID. I think certainly technology enables that. The only thing I would say about it is just be cautious about assuming that that solves the problem. The more trusted the digital identity is, the higher its commercial value when stolen. And that never goes away as an issue. So I think that means that one has to have a kind of distributed trust system. There has to be more than one way to verify in order to guard against that problem. And to that goes also behavioural hacking and phishing. You can have the best security in the world, but there's always con men. And in the digital world, we have more and more new ways, if you will, to con people. We need to be aware of that. In terms of actual policy, I think maybe around cybersecurity, given that I think every private individual and also private companies are quite conscious of it, maybe the biggest area for policy is around protecting against state-sponsored nefarious activity. And that's where government obviously has a clear role to play, given its resources. And also to be aware of the rising importance of policy around machine trust. So the more we have interconnected machines, what I mean by machine trust is a machine can be compromised. Everyone's probably experienced having a virus on their computer and waking up in the middle of the night and going, why is my computer doing all that? It's because it's been infected with some kind of Trojan or virus. So machine trust is very important, and that has to be integrated with human trust. But I think actually in policy terms, the best thing you could possibly do as a government is encourage a well-functioning, healthy private sector involved in digital security innovation, because that's where the solutions are likely to come from. And then finally, data architecture and regulatory analytics. This is a program that we started at CIFR a few months ago, brainchild of CEO David Gallagher. What we're really about is trying to understand how the available data might be queried or linked better for the purpose of effective enforcement of regulation, but also understanding what's happening. So this really speaks to the balance of regulation versus enforcement. If an entity like ASIC is budget challenged, maybe that has something to do with business process and people. Maybe with a more emphasis on big data analytics, it would be possible to change that mix slightly and achieve better results. So that's really a question for research. One of the important things where we perceive Australia is behind other leading economies like the US is policies for mandating machine readability of data. A great example I could give there is the SEC's EDGAR database, which is the legal copy of a company's filings. It's mandated that it is both the legal copy, the electronic copy is the legal copy, and also it is mandated that it must be machine readable. And that's enabled an enormous amount of innovation, not only in the private sector, but also in academic research. So they're all important. And then finally, I guess we're interested in policies on sharing, aggregation, and anonymisation of data. So this is an important research area where it can help ameliorate some of the problems about these technologies of machine learning and so on applied to large data sets and customer privacy and the protection of that. So anonymisation principles are very important in that area. And so to close, I just say a shameless advert. You're here at a wonderful CIFR event. We will be hosting another one on October 1st in this location, and it's to deal with these issues of regulatory data and analytics, and we'll have a note go out shortly concerning the program and invitations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kingsley. just listening to Kingsley, I think today, moving through the topics in such a broad array of areas, it gives us a sense of the task facing the Secretariat and the panel. And I think of the analogy of drinking from a fire hose. This is a lot to take in, but I think it's, we're identifying some significant issues and significant areas that the Secretariat needs to look at in order to be in a position to form a policy recommendations. Hopefully that this is helping a number of you with your own submissions that are due on Tuesday, because it's an important opportunity for the voices of the industry to be heard. Thanks for that, and if you haven't submitted yet, continue to do that. Our next speaker is Professor Ross Buckley. Ross is going to present on international integration, and Ross is also another of our presenters today who is undertaking research under a CIFR sponsorship. Welcome to Ross.
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks for the opportunity to CIFR to be here. So, international integration. How internationally financially integrated is Australia? There's the chart out of the report. Australia's the blue bar in the middle. We're sort of exactly where you'd expect us to be. A little bit less integrated than Canada, the US and the EU, a little bit more than Japan and New Zealand. Hong Kong and Singapore are the top bars. It's calculated as the combination of foreign assets and liabilities over your domestic GDP. So they're so large not because of the size of their sectors, but the smallness of their GDP. And London makes UK the really important global financial centre. But with where are we integrated? The report says, well, our main financial relationships are with Europe and the US, but in trade terms, we're heavily integrated in Asia. This is true. What the report doesn't say is that in that sense, in that context, we are like every other nation in East Asia, right? Most East Asian nations today are heavily integrated in formal trade terms. There's a noodle bowl of trade agreements, which Australia is rapidly joining. They're heavily integrated in production terms. There's now a hub and spoke system. Most production's in China. Countries contribute in the areas of financial advantage. But in finance terms, most East Asian nations are still integrated with the US and the EU. So we are just like everybody else. If I jump forward, I'm looking at a few things here that I think the report underplays. I think the biggest thing, perhaps, the report underplays is the potential for Australia of true financial integration in the region. At some point, our region is going to stop being principally integrated with the US and the EU, and it's going to become integrated with itself because it has the highest savings rates in the world. There's no reason for the money to leave Asia, be intermediated somewhere else and come back in the long term. And so the question for 25 years or more has been, how do we create a regional financial centre in Sydney? I went to my first presentation on government-funded thing on this more than 25 years ago. I think it's probably the wrong question. I think the report hasn't looked into it too much because I think, frankly, we're all bored with the question. I think maybe the right question is, what's the role for Australia in the financial integration of East Asia with itself? When this sea change comes through, when we stop being so integrated with the US and the EU, and we get integrated with the savings that are in the region, they look like the same question. I don't think they are quite the same question. The second one is subtly different from the first one. And one of the big drivers that is obviously going to, the rise of the renminbi is going to be critical in this, but I'm not going to talk about that because that's the next presentation. So just jumping back through the slides a little bit, this is the chart in terms of where we're going that this interim report has used. The orange line is Asia. You can see, back in the days of Campbell and Wallace, it was a totally different world. Now we are about 4 years away from the point where the percentage of world output produced by Asia exceeds that produced by the advanced economies, right? So that means, looks like we're in the right part of the world, doesn't it? But it's perhaps not so reason to get so excited. We go back a couple of months, ASIC, there was a final report into ASIC. This is the chart that ASIC used. Same time frame out to 2050. What it's done is it's disaggregated the US and the EU, so you've got to add them up together, and to get to the advanced economies, you'd have to add Australia and Canada. And then it's aggregated the Asia top 10, so China, Japan, India, South Korea, down as far as Vietnam. The 10th smallest economy in Asia is Vietnam. All of a sudden, I think this chart shows what a strange thing. that that line that's soaring off into the, into the stratosphere is financially integrated with these two lines down here. So I think there's a really big potential sea change coming through that this report really profoundly underestimates. Depends which chart you look at. Okay, moving on. A couple of other things I think it's underplayed. I think it's underplayed the transformative potential of the amount of funds under management in super. Of course, it talks a lot about it. Superannuation already is at 1.8 trillion. The total money invested in the Australian Stock Exchange is 1.6 trillion. So there's more money invested in super than in companies in this country today. You look forward though, by 2033, it's going to have increased to 180% of GDP. It's about 100% of GDP at the moment. This is going to be a game changer. One of the ways it has already been alluded to today is our superannuation scheme is heavily skewed towards equities. We're completely out of step internationally. You look at Germany or the US, they're about 40% in bonds. We're about 10% in bonds, right? So superannuation is going to provide the drive for a bond market in Australia, I think, on the demand side. And the report talks a lot about bonds, bonds as a response to the financing problems for SMEs, the proposal to allow listed companies to issue bonds without a prospectus. There's a fair bit in there. But there's got to be the demand, and I think the demand's going to come from super. Bonds are particularly well suited to the drawdown phase, the retirement phase, which is where more of our super is heading. The other thing I think the report heavily underplays is the impact of tax. Our banks are the safest and most profitable in the world, and the report tells us 6% of their liabilities come from abroad. That's extraordinarily small. Now, it is true, to be fair to Mr. Murray, there's a taxation review coming down the pipe, and I think he's been told to go soft on tax. So that's understandable. But the report does do a bit on interest withholding tax on retail deposits of non-residents, which Johnson and Ken Henry both recommend be removed. But I think there's something far more fundamental. There's a lot of uncertainty in Australia's tax regime when you've got money coming from abroad into Australia. There's fundamental questions. If the money is really managed in Australia, does that make it an Australian tax resident, in effect? If the decisions are being made here, should Australian tax be paid on the earnings? And they are really complicated things. Trust me, my wife's a tax barrister. She bombards me with this stuff. It gives me headaches all the time. It is seriously complicated, and we need a really fundamental review of how our taxation regime is affecting our international integration. The reason I've put tax rules up the top is not because it's a really complex body of rules, but it is. But my experience when I was practicing law is tax always determines. You're structuring a transaction, you do it in the most tax-effective measure. If our tax regime doesn't support integration, we are not going to get it, and we shouldn't pretend ourselves that we are. Another point the FSI makes is that they think the coordination of our international financial integration could be improved. They put up some alternatives, and this is what we're going to give you a little vote on at the end. Should there be an expanded role for the Council of Financial Regulators or for the FSAC or the RBA, or should there be a Treasury Minister to champion Australia's financial services? Should there be a government resource focused on competitiveness with the ability to generate legislation? It's not so easy to do when you don't control the Senate, but I suppose we're looking beyond that. Do we need some sort of standing body to improve communication between the market and government? So the FSI seems to be flagging fairly clearly that the integration, the coordination of our financial activities is not as good as it could be, and they're really looking for input on that. The other thing, and the thing that I'll finish on, which I think also the report has, this is probably a bit critical. You can't really expect them. This is more of my personal hobby horse. When I teach in my faculty, I look out on a room like this, 2/3 of the faces are Asian Australians. That's our student body, right, today in law at UNSW. They're wonderful students. They're there because they've got the best marks in the state. They've got a really deep cultural understanding, and they've got a range of language skills from basic Chinese to fluency. They're an extraordinary resource for Australia. I don't think we've worked it out yet as a nation. What I notice is if I was a business hiring in Australia, I'd be knocking down the door to get to these kids because they've grown up with one foot in China and one foot in Australia. They're typically either the first generation children of immigrants, or they moved here when they were 2 or 4 or 6 years of age. We've also got a new Colombo plan, which is a really dramatic piece of thinking outside the box by our government. Our government's plan, it wants to see a semester of study in an Asian university become a rite of passage for young Australians. And you hear really good things back from the Asian universities once they work out we're serious about this and this is not window dressing. You know, the first response is what? You know, you really are going to send Australian students to the University of Indonesia to study? And the federal government's answer is yes. And you know, this long term, if we're talking about regional financial integration, I think it's based on these sorts of things. Financial services is purely a people game. We all know that. It's all about skills, but in integration terms, it's about understanding other cultures, about having some language skills, and it's about, you know, all of this sort of stuff. The new Colombo, I don't agree with I was in the consultative group for this. I didn't agree with the name because Colombo doesn't exist anymore, right? So I thought that was a problem. But anyway, the old Colombo plan was a wonderful piece of soft power diplomacy in Australia, right? It was one of the best things I think most people think we ever did, so that's why the government wanted to keep the name. The new one is a really interesting piece of thinking. You know, Asian language study in Australian schools is on the decline. The government's now committed itself to change that. So, in conclusion, I think the report underplays the potential for Australia if the region, or when the region starts to integrate with itself. That's the sea change. I think it underplays the sheer impact of the volume of funds under management we're going to have in super, and it underplays how much our current tax regime works against us. Perhaps it felt that wasn't its job, but I think it, you know, and I think it could have displayed a broad appreciation of what I call the human factors, which I think long term are really, really critical. But it's a balanced and it's insightful report, and I think it's laying the basis for a good future for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. He essentially posed the question that you've been asked to respond to. I'm so interested in your responses. Okay, thanks. Keep sending them in. The final presenter prior to lunch is Geoff Weir, and Geoff's going to present on opportunities in the Asian century and internationalisation of the renminbi. So please welcome Geoff.
Thank you very much. A lot to say in very little time, so I'll get right into it. Ross has just done a great job of talking in broad terms about international integration, what's happening in Asia. I want to hone in on China and what's happening in China with the opening up of its capital markets. Some of the points that I'll make are more broadly applicable to developments in Asia, but there are some unique features of China and of our relationship with China that I think make it particularly important to this issue of financial integration. Sorry, we've jumped ahead here. The first one is that size matters. Size does matter. We're all very familiar with the fact that China's already the world's largest trading nation. It's the largest single source of savings. It will soon be the largest economy in the world. What often gets less focus is the fact that within a decade or less on current trends, China will also have the largest equity market in the world and the second largest fixed income market in the world. And there have been a number of studies by the IMF and by other organisations which are discussed in the CIFR report that we did last March on RMB internationalisation. These studies look at the associated capital flows into and out of China, and they all conclude that these flows will be truly massive. And I think that's the reason why Phil Lowe, the Deputy Governor of the RBA, in a couple of very good recent speeches on China, has made comments along the following lines that the opening up of China's capital markets, quote, could well turn out to be one of the seismic events in global capital markets over the coming years. So how much of these portfolio and direct investment flows, both into China and out of China, are likely to involve Australia? Again, the potential is enormous for a number of reasons. One is that there's just a natural fit between China and Australia. Australia's a capital importer, China's a capital exporter. Australia's rich in agriculture and energy resources. China has more need for food and energy security. And Australia has what I think most people would agree generally is an efficient, innovative and well-regulated financial sector, while the very rapid growth in the Chinese middle class means they've got an increasing need for financial services. Another reason why the potential for greater two-way flows is enormous is that China's already our major trading partner by a country mile, and history tells us that typically finance follows trade, but it doesn't automatically follow trade. So this potential for our financial links more closely resembling our trade links, it won't happen automatically. What I want to focus on for the rest of the presentation is what are some of the constraints to it happening. So let me first focus on constraints in China, and in particular on how quickly these constraints are changing. I mentioned earlier that China is already the world's largest potential source of capital for international investment, but at present, due to the fact that it's got a fixed exchange rate and it's still got a lot of capital controls in place, the bulk of those savings end up in rising foreign exchange reserves, and those reserves are typically invested quite narrowly, very heavily obviously in US Treasuries. Internationalising the Chinese currency, the renminbi, so that it becomes widely used outside of China for both trade and investment purposes, requires, amongst other things, removing capital controls and floating the currency. So as these policy changes in China are put into place, increasingly the excess savings will be invested through the private sector and through state-owned enterprises, rather than just appearing in higher foreign exchange accumulation. And in every sector of the Chinese economy where there are large pools of savings, whether it's the household sector, the corporate sector, the official sector, there's a growing need for portfolio diversification, including heavily into international assets, both for risk diversification reasons and for enhancing returns. And for the reasons I've already mentioned, Australia is potentially a major beneficiary of these capital outflows from China. Removing capital controls, developing China's capital markets, improving corporate governance, and moving to a floating exchange rate, these are all necessary requirements for making the renminbi an international currency, and that's a policy that the Chinese government's committed to. But the question is, how long is it going to take? I'd like to stress 2 points. One, these changes are happening now, and they're happening at an accelerating pace. So almost on a day-by-day basis, new opportunities are arising for financial links and doing financial business with China. In the CIFR report that I mentioned earlier, we set out a range of reasons why we believe that these changes will be well and truly bedded down in the course of the next decade, and possibly a lot sooner than that. I haven't got the time to go into them in detail, but let me just mention one. I think it's a particularly important one. And that's the observation that the policy reforms that China needs to put in place to internationalise the currency are also policy reforms that are vital for domestic policy objectives. I'm thinking of objectives like more efficient allocation of credit in the economy, building a national pension scheme, and rebalancing growth more towards consumption and less investment. So with these Chinese constraints to financial integration being rapidly removed, the next question is, how well is Australia positioned to take advantage of it? I want to start by talking about some non-policy issues and then move on to some policy issues. I think on the non-policy side, there's both good news and bad news in terms of how the private sector is positioned. On the positive side, there have been some very exciting recent market innovations and initiatives that will certainly help facilitate greater financial market integration between Australia and the region. One that's particularly worth mentioning, I think, is the new Bank of China ASX RMB clearing arrangement using the ASX's AustraClear system. This initiative has the capacity over time to handle a wide range of RMB transactions, including RMB-denominated bonds and derivative instruments. It also has the capacity over time to be expanded to more currencies, including currencies in the region. On the negative side, I think it's fair to say that the private sector awareness of what's happening in China and what it means is still pretty patchy, including in parts of the banking sector, including certainly in many bank customers who are doing business in China, and also parts of the funds management sector. That's one reason why the private sector-led RMB working group that was set up in 2013 is a particularly important body. One of its main focuses is raising awareness of how much business you can already do with China because of the gradual liberalisation of its capital controls. The official family, by which I mean in particular the RBA and Treasury, are already doing, in my view, a superb job of raising awareness of what's happening in China, both through their speeches, lots of them by Phil Lowe, who's given some excellent speeches, and also through their involvement in bodies like the RMB working group that I mentioned. But having said that, I'm certainly in the camp that says there's a significant scope for improving private sector, public sector coordination, not just in this space of international integration, but more broadly on financial market policy issues. Ross touched on this, so I agree with everything he said. I don't think there's a need for a radical change in structures. I think there's a need for more subtle changes. Mark Johnson, who's speaking this afternoon, and I put in a submission to the FSI on this. It's publicly available. I haven't got the time to go into it now, but I think there's a lot of scope for improvement in this area. Despite Australia having a high-quality financial sector, our exports of financial services are extremely small compared to most other countries, and you can see that in this chart here. What this chart shows is for Australian financial services exports. The exports are in the blue lines, and imports as a percentage of financial services value added, and the same for many other countries. And you can see just how closed, in a sense, our financial sector is. An important aspect of this is funds management, where despite the size of our funds management sector, despite its sophistication, less than 5% of the assets under management are sourced offshore. Some of the reasons for that were discussed in detail in the Johnson report, and I'll return to what I believe is the main one shortly. But I do think, and I think Ross touched on this as well, I do think this is a topic that deserves further attention in the final FSI report. Given the fact that it's vitally important that any constraints to Australia exporting in areas where we have a comparative advantage are removed, unnecessary constraints are removed. And given that we do have a very efficient, competitive, well-regulated, highly regarded financial sector, there's some really important issues here about why aren't we exporting more financial services. Turning now to policy issues. We've got a lot of the financial architecture already in place for being in a position to take advantage of what's happening in China. By that I mean, in particular, the swap facility between the central banks, the direct trading of the two currencies, and the fact that we've got all of the major, or most of the major Chinese banks have a presence in Australia. Treasury has also done an enormous amount of work on the Asian Funds Management Passport that some of you will be familiar with. This is basically designed to make it easier for a fund that's registered in one country in the region to sell its product in other countries in the region. It's a long, hard slog, but it's potentially very, very beneficial. And hats off to Treasury for the great work that they have been doing. Rumour has it that a lot of progress is also being made on Australia being granted an RQFI licence. This is a licence that would make it easier for Australian fund managers who want to invest directly in mainland Chinese financial assets to get access. It was one of the recommendations in the CIFR report, and if the rumours on this front are correct, then I think that's also a very welcome development. Still on the work in progress front, I thought it was very encouraging that the FSI Interim Report talked about the need for further development of the corporate bond market. But unless I just didn't see it, what was missing, I think, in the analysis was the link between developing the corporate bond market and regional integration. As countries in the region remove capital controls and improve their capital markets, then a lot of companies in the region are going to look to broaden their sources of funding beyond just bank loans. Australia already has a good regulatory framework. It's got well-developed futures and derivatives markets, which are critical for managing fixed income risk. If we can also broaden and deepen our capital markets, then we've got the potential to become a regional hub, both for initial capital raisings by companies in the region and for secondary market trading. I think that is a link that's very important and needs to be taken into account in the final report. This brings me to the big negative on the policy front issue, and it won't surprise you because Ross has already touched on it and I completely agree with what he said. The big constraint to better financial integration for Australia is our tax system, and in particular, the confusing and inconsistent way in which we tax a whole range of cross-border financial transactions. This is arguably most evident in the funds management space, and this was a central focus of the Johnson report. The consequence of this tax uncertainty is a lot of overseas potential investors and a lot of overseas investment advisors just will not do business with Australia. It's too risky, it's too uncertain, so they won't touch it. The FSI Interim Report asked for further information on the relative importance of different impediments to greater financial integration. Well, you really don't need to look any further than the tax system. That is the biggest impediment. Unfortunately, it's still the case. It was the case when we gave our Johnson report to the government in late 2009. They responded in 2010, but it's still the case. A lot of those tax issues have not been dealt with or have been very inadequately dealt with. In particular, on the key recommendation in the Johnson report for dealing with tax uncertainty by putting in place an investment management regime, very little progress has been made in 4 years. The FSI Interim Report raises this and other tax-related issues, some out of the Johnson report, some more broad, in its table 10.2. Its terms of reference, as Ross mentioned, perhaps constrain it from making firm recommendations on tax issues, but they do allow it to, quote, provide observations that could inform the tax white paper. In my view, what I think would be very helpful is that if further FSI consultations and submissions confirm it, then the final report should observe that tax issues are one of the main, if not the main, constraints to greater financial integration. That's an observation, not a recommendation, but it's potentially a powerful observation. Just a couple of concluding comments. Having worked on some policy advice issues for, 4 or 5 years now, one thing I've learned is that it takes a lot of factors falling into place to get policies agreed to and bedded down. In the case of policy issues relating to financial integration, what's happening in China and Asia more broadly, I think there are grounds for believing that some of the planets are aligning. So I do think there's grounds for optimism. Firstly, China itself, its size, the speed of change in China is focusing attention more and more on what we need to have in place to take advantage of it, whether it's China or the region more generally, but China is definitely helping to focus attention. Secondly, at the political level, there are finally some very positive signs that after 4 largely wasted years, we will get a workable, broad investment management regime in place reasonably soon. I don't want to count my chickens, but the signs are good, and I certainly hope that's the case. In the interest of time, maybe I'll skip the next two, just go to the last one. Last, but certainly by far least. The FSI final report itself, if it does highlight some of these issues that have been discussed on financial integration and some of the constraints, that should also help in getting some of the necessary policy changes bedded down. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Geoff. I'm just going to now explain a little bit about lunch, but by all means, please send in your responses to the question before you, and we can all see how those responses pan out. Now, as you'll have seen from the program, it's essentially a working lunch with a couple of video presentations to be screened, and we're going to kick that off at 10 to the hour. So lunch will be served in here. So a little bit of time, not long, I appreciate, but a little bit of time, and we ask that you come back promptly, be seated around 10 to the hour, and lunch will be served in here, and David will take to the microphone to get us underway for that particular session. So I hope you've enjoyed the session and the workshop so far today, and see you shortly. Thank you.